For hunters, it hurts. For non-hunters, they're like, yay! The deer won! Yes, it did. It wins a lot. How many years now has it won on y'all?
For me?
Yeah.
It's been quite a few.
Put together a cheerleading outfit that says, go deer.
Exactly. My daughter's wearing it.
Yeah. I didn't get one last year.
Did you hear about
This year.
Do what?
the new world religion? That was, I don't know what you call it, it started yesterday.
Every day something wild happens somewhere on some corner of the earth. When I was in college, the House of Yahweh, which is a West Texas cult, was predicting the end of the world for the, I don't know, fourth or fifth time.
Is that the one they've been called Christian nationalism, but it's
No, those are not the same things.
Now this is the Pope, the self-appointed God, and some Muslim guy came together and started a new religion between Muslims and
I'm interested if this is a real thing or something you found on like page 75 of the internet.
I don't know, I was at the dump way before.
Listen, neighborhood-friendly reminder that just because you read about it does not make it a real thing.
That's the truth.
I can go start a web page tomorrow and create anything I want to, and it's out there for forever.
That's right.
Playground rules have made their way to the internet. That's one of those things where, like in the 90s, as the internet was going public, we had so much hope for what it was going to do for society by providing access to information. For a brief moment there, it was a beautiful, beautiful thing. And then y'all ruined it. Non-nerds got a hold of the internet, started using it for non-nerdy things, and it just got all messed up. Back when us nerds were in control of it, it was just fine.
I'm sorry.
This is, hey, and I say this,
wrong with your statement.
no, there's nothing wrong with my statement, because I remember Facebook when you had to have a college email address to get onto Facebook, and you know what wasn't on Facebook then? Conspiracy theories. Now, they pretended we were supposed to get together and study. That's what its great use was going to be. It was never used for that. But you had to have a college email address, and then they let old people on it. Now I'm one of those old people who got allowed on.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. And now that's saved for forever. I'll edit that out tomorrow. Hooray for post-production. Good morning, everybody. Glad you are here. We are continuing. Oh, nope, that's turned to the wrong place. Sorry, I rewrote my entire sermon introduction this morning after we got here, and now it's turned to where that's going to be, so that's not even remotely helpful. There we go. Or I could just do the whole sermon now and then say, oops, and a nice warm-up lap, and then we'll do it all over again in there. Y'all can just, go home. So, no, that's actually a bit of a throwback. So, early pandemic, when we first came back to in-person and we had 2 services kind of capped at 50 people each, if you were there for early service, you saw the asleep version of me kind of working my way through it. I'm really sorry. If you came to second service, I was finally awake and had already done it once, so I knew what worked and what didn't. Second service me was way better than first service me. Now y'all only get first service me, and I apologize. All right, so we're continuing on today our study of how to read the Bible. What is this book that we've got? How did we get it? What's the best ways to approach it? What are some of the classic pitfalls that people have fallen into while reading it? We've kind of worked our way through the New Testament. I'm going to kind of introduce the Old Testament broadly today and talk a bit about narratives more specifically. But we'll get there here in just a minute. First, let's open with a word of prayer. God, we thank you for today, for the blessing that it is to be together as a family in your name. I pray that as we dive into your text, as we learn more about this word that you've left for us, that we would do a better job of taking it into our hearts and our lives, to allow it to change us into your people. This is our prayer in Jesus' name. Amen. All right. So there are a few things I want to point out before we really start talking about the Old Testament. One is that historically, Christians have done a terrible job reading the Old Testament. We just have. There are a few reasons for that. Oh, and one of which is, especially in the modern era, we just don't care to read the Old Testament that much. We like the parts that we can connect to the New Testament easily. But past that, we don't have a whole lot of time for it. And I think part of that is how we've done children's education. Because for the most part, children's education is very story-focused, right? Well, the Old Testament is 40% narrative. So we've taught those as children's stories because they teach easily. They kind of teach easily. Teaching 6-year-olds about the flood is kind of sketchy territory. You're talking about an R-rated storyline that you've got to clean up massively to make it flannel graph appropriate. Have you noticed that none of those flannel graphs ever had like dead bodies floating in the water around the boat? Not a children's story in any way, form, or fashion, but it is a narrative. It's from the Old Testament. It's comfortable. It's a pretty well-known story. It's easy to throw up there. Same thing with David and Goliath. I vividly remember the teacher that had cut a piece of red felt, and when she put the little flannel graph stone in Goliath's forehead, she put the red felt on it below. I was like, but Goliath didn't bleed. Like David had high-fived him, and he fell over or something like that. The problem with doing stories like that as children's stories when they're 4 or 5 is then they go home and play David and Goliath. And I know this because I have children looking for excuses to whack each other. Here, you be Goliath. That's how we've done Old Testament stories. We take the narratives, the parts that we like, we clean them up, we teach them to children. And then as adults, we move on. We spend all of our time studying Romans. The church that I grew up in, we had I use Romans as an example for a reason. I could tell you that every year we were going to get like a 39-week series on Romans. It was his favorite material. Even when he was preaching other stuff, he came back and referenced Romans all the time. We hone in on our favorites, the stuff that gives us talking points and things to argue about, or passages that give us courage or hope, and those are important things, but we often leave the Old Testament behind. The other thing we do with the Old Testament is we either allegorize it. These are all just images of something to come later, which is certainly not how it was written or read by its first audience, or we turn them into morality tales. The problem with doing that is very often the stories we're reading, the way they were written, they're not morality tales. There are really terrible people who win all throughout. There are really good people who lose all throughout the Old Testament. There are moments where you see great people do terrible things and terrible people do great things. And those stories don't end with nice little bows tied on top of it. There's not a moment where one of my favorite terrible stories from the Old Testament is Jephthah, right? Leader of the people, man of God. God works on his behalf. He wins for the people, and he makes this promise to God, when I go home, I will sacrifice the first thing that comes out of my house. If this was some nice, clean morality tale about God's love and rescue and our impetuousness, but God's ability to prevent us from it, then God should stop the whole thing. Child sacrifice is by no means promoted anywhere in the law. But Jephthah sacrifices a child. And God doesn't stop it. There's no nice clean bow on that one, is there? But we pass over those stories, in children's class especially, because we're not telling stories about parents sacrificing children. That'd freak some kids out, wouldn't they? Next time you start yelling at them when they're in trouble, don't burn me! But then we don't know what to do with them as adults either, because they don't line up with what we know to be true of God. And I think the problem of that whole experience stems from us reading the Old Testament so poorly. So I want to give a few pointers for how to read the Old Testament, I think, more faithfully and more accurately. And the first thing I would tell you is that these stories were written down by people who were the exact same as the audience they were writing to, which means they shared the same assumptions, understandings, traditions, inside jokes, colloquial language, things that fly right over our head today, that you have to dig and dig and dig and dig and dig to get a fragment of. They weren't written for a 21st century audience. They were written for the audience of their time period. They were meant to tell a story, make a point along the way. But when we read it with 21st century eyes, we already have set off on the wrong foot for understanding what we've been given. It's important for us to understand their world at least a little bit if we want to understand it. The other thing that I would point out about reading the Old Testament is that we need to do it. All of it. Yes, even Numbers. Those things matter. They wrote them down for a reason. And just because we struggle to understand it does not make it bad or useless. It means that we need to do a better job digging into it to see what might be there for us. What's going on that might tell us something about God. John Goldengate is one of my favorite Old Testament scholars. He's at, down in California. I suddenly forgot the name of it. I had a friend that just finished his doctorate there, and now it escapes me. Do what? No. He's not one of ours. Old Testament scholar. We don't produce a whole lot of those. We got a couple of them. Abram Mallerby is one of them. John Willis is another out of the Church of Christ circle that are solid Old Testament scholars, but we haven't produced a ton of them. No, Goldengate is at, this is going to drive me nuts until I think about it, so y'all be prepared to watch me lose my mind because it's gone. Anyway, he describes the New Testament as footnotes to the Old Testament, and he says that as a faithful Christian, a guy who loves Jesus and knows his Old Testament. He's forgotten more about the New Testament than I'll ever know. But what he's telling us is that the God that we see show up in the form of Jesus, that's not a new invention or creation. That says something about a God who has been working from the beginning of time. And if we see the God of the Old Testament as different than we see Jesus, then we're probably already misreading. That, or we're making an assumption that God somehow massively changes in the interim period between the last of the prophets and the New Testament when Jesus shows up. And I'm not going to step out on a limb and say that either. So there's something good there to be read and understood. The stories on those pages give us important information about who God is, and we've relativized them. We made them nice children's stories to kill class time while we learn as grown-ups the real stuff from 1 Corinthians. And I think that's a terrible way to look at the Old Testament. It's the story of God and God's people. The other thing that's important to know about the Old Testament, it is not a historical textbook. The biggest thing that I think we misunderstand is we love linear history, right? We like chronologies and timelines. This starts in our education system from the time we're children. One of the first assignments I remember doing as a kid in elementary school is a personal timeline. We talked about our own history and we laid everything out, all 9 years of my life. As great as that was, I peaked, I think, around 8. I got that Bible for bringing the most visitors to VBS. That was my marker of accomplishment. We like linear history. And anything that isn't that, we struggle with. Ancient people did not do linear history. And they also didn't do static facts and figures very often. So when you see in the Bible, and there are a couple of places where this is the case, Numbers being one of them, when you see static, exact numbers, there's something going on there to pay attention to. But you get all sorts of moments in the Bible where you're in the middle of what is a story with some root in history, written hundreds of years after the event. And you'll find that they're repeating key words along the way, and that's because the details of the story are not what matters to them, it's the point. We do this too, right? How many of you have stories from your life that you tell other people from time to time when you're getting to know them, or one of those you tell your kids or your grandkids the story of how we met or something along those lines? How many of you have those personal stories that mean something that you share with others, that you shared with other people more than once? You get those details exactly the same every time? Yeah, you do. The details change. Not massively. Depending on the setting you're telling it in and who you're telling it to, the age of the person you're telling it to, the experiences that they have. You see this with the story of Paul's conversion in the book of Acts. One time that the story of the conversion is told, the men who were with Paul didn't hear anything. Another time that it's told, they heard something. Do we cast the story out because the details have changed? No, the point of the story is not the details. You look at what audience is there and why the sharing of the story might change and what point is trying to be made. Because the point, the message of God through the point, is what's holy, is what matters. Details of our own stories are always in flux. We forget things. Anybody ever forgotten anything in here? I've had those moments where I've been telling a story and Lindsay elbows me. It's like, that's not what happened. It's how I remember it. But some of those details have shifted. They've gone fuzzy. But the details are not the point. The details in the Bible are almost never the point. And yet because we, linear history, detail-oriented people in the 21st century, want to find that, then that tends to be what we look for and what we see. And so when the details don't line up perfectly, like Paul's 3 conversion stories as told in Acts, we have to figure out how to square them up. Luke wrote that knowing that there were detail differences in the 2 stories, and he didn't try to square them up. So what's actually going on? We've got to do a better job of asking those questions. That is especially true in the Old Testament. And I want to give you, we'll start with an example here. This side of the room, if you've got your Bibles, digital, hard copy, memorized, don't care what, go ahead and turn to, we'll have you all do 2 Kings 21. 2 Kings 21 in this half of the room. This half of the room, we're going to do 2 Chronicles 33. 2 Kings 21, 2 Chronicles 33. Okay, now, what I love about this is that both of you have turned to passages about the same king. So, in 21, you've got, is it at the beginning or the middle that you get Manasseh? Beginning. 33, it's the beginning also. You stumble into Manasseh, correct?
Yeah.
All right, so I'm going to provide a few minutes of silence. And I want y'all to read through 21 and be prepared to answer, just the Manasseh part. Be prepared to answer a couple questions about Manasseh. I want y'all to read through 33, just the Manasseh part, and be ready to answer a couple of questions about Manasseh. On your mark, get set, go. And I'm going to use this time to get some water, because I've already done the homework. Hold it. Hold it. Good grain. Thank you. All right, now we're going to find out who's the fast readers and who are not fast readers. How many of you have already finished the assigned section? Yeah, I know you, Rob. Okay, I'll give you a couple more minutes. Also, the answer is Fuller Theological Seminary is where Goldengate was at. Thank you, Rob, for looking up the information for me. Okay, when you finish, just kind of throw a hand up in the air so I know who's reading and who's done. Okay, a couple of them.
How far are we supposed to read?
Just the Manasseh part.
Oh,
So if you're in 33, that takes you down to
verse 20.
Thank you. I think y'all had a little bit more to read. We'll see that here in just a second as to why. Okay. The quietest this room has ever been. All right. So assuming that you're done or close to done, my second Kings people. Manasseh, good guy, bad guy.
Terrible.
How bad?
Really worse than all the
Previous people.
Repentant at all? Chronicles people.
Bad guy who repented.
Bad guy who repented.
You guys don't know anything.
That's from
The first half of the Chronicles passage reads nearly identical to the King's passage.
Very bad guy.
But there is this turn in the Chronicles passage where, if y'all want to turn over and look at it, you can. It's 2 Chronicles 33, right, is where I put you. Where something happens in Manasseh's life, according to the chronicler, that is not recorded by the author or authors of Kings, where Manasseh repents and changes his direction and tears down the idols that he helped build up and turns the land back to God. That's how the book of Chronicles reads. If you read the Kings passage, that half of the story never occurs. Manasseh is a terrible person. Nothing ever changes. He sacrifices his own child. He never repents. His life ends in anonymity, and his child carries on his tradition of being a terrible person. Chronicles includes that his child was a terrible person. But you get that brief interruption there where Manasseh gets things together, turns himself and the people back to God. Now, yeah.
In the death of Manasseh in 2 Chronicles, talks about his turn.
Yes.
Yeah.
Not in Kings.
Right. Took the hook in his nose, though.
Yes. Well, I mean, sure. The Assyrians were good at that. Oh, sorry. Babylon. No, Assyrians. I had it right the first time. Assyrians were good at that. Babylonians were too. They learned from each other, which is not necessarily the stuff you want to learn. No, if you read the book of Chronicles, Manasseh turns, repents, gets it together. If you read the book of Kings, Manasseh doesn't. And therein we have a problem, right? If your expectation of the Bible is that it is a perfect recording of the details that happen, we have a crisis moment. Now, that, I think, a perfect recording of the details, is a poor reading of Scripture. That's not what's going on. The books of Kings and Chronicles were written at different times to different people in different situations. So if you're receiving the book of Kings in the midst of a moment of national failing, let's go with that, where the people have all turned away from God and, sorry, backwards. At a moment where things are good, but you can see the beginnings of some of those historic failings. Idolatry beginning to creep in, turning away from God in some small ways. Then you share the story of Manasseh, where things go horribly wrong, the nation is in an absolute pit, and they're all hauled off into captivity. If you're already in captivity, you share the story of Manasseh who repents. Because as bad as things are, there's always hope. You see where you tell those stories different, depending on the situation. In one case, you need a stern warning about the dangers of walking away. In the other, you need a story of promise and hope for things that have already gone wrong. That doesn't make either of the stories right or wrong, but the setting dictates which parts of the story you share and why. We do that as people too. There are stories from my childhood that I tell my kids, and there are different parts of those stories they'll hear when they get older. Because the setting, the age, all of that dictates what gets communicated. That is true of our Old Testament authors. They're not sitting down to write a detailed linear history the way we would like, right? Chapter 1 of the book of the people of Israel. It was a Tuesday. It's not a diary. There's something bigger going on, and the authors are telling the story of God and God's people and what that relationship looks like and why it matters. And so in some of those moments you withhold details, and some of those moments you share. That's an important consideration when we read any of the Bible. Old Testament included. Yeah, Tim.
I think that's a lot of the reason why, as we read, and why we should continue to read, that different things will all of a sudden pop up.
Yeah.
Because it's a different time in your life, and you realize that hey, this really speaks to me now, and I understand what's going on. And other times it's like, goes right over your head.
One of my favorite moments on the teaching end of my time in ministry has been at our church in Oklahoma. I was doing a World of the New Testament class. So we were talking about backgrounds in history and what's going on in Palestine and in Rome at the time. And I actually think I did this on recorded lesson while we were in pandemic mode. So it's out there in the interwebs somewhere. You can track it down on the Facebook page. And I'm trying to load all of those to YouTube as well. Anyway, there's this passage in the New Testament that escapes me at the moment where exactly it's located, but some people come up to Jesus asking about the Galileans whose blood Pilate had intermingled with the sacrifices. So that's an easily explainable passage, right? It is if you know the history. So what's going on at that moment, and it actually happened several times throughout Pilate's reign, really terrible dude in a lot of ways, is that he participated, commanded, organized the massacre of Jewish pilgrims headed to Jerusalem. In one particular case, it was a group of Galilean pilgrims working their way to Jerusalem that Pilate's soldiers massacred. So historically speaking, that's very likely the question that Jesus is being asked. What about those guys? Especially since Jesus is a Galilean, they're his kin in some way or another. Your tribe, your region matters. I was doing this class in Oklahoma, and there's this woman who I know read her Bible backwards and forwards 17 times a year. If I needed to know where something was, if I started to butcher a verse, she was the one who corrected me. It's lovely to have somebody with that level of knowledge. And I heard her as she disappeared into the teen couch in the teen room where we were teaching. The old couches get donated, the ones that swallow people whole. And she's like half sunk into this couch, and she's like, I've never seen that before. Because it had not made sense, her brain had just skipped the passage because she didn't know what to do with it. Suddenly, sometimes we know what to do with it. The setting of our own lives has changed. The details of the story catch us in a different way, or for the first time, we read it and get the point. So, with...
Wait a minute. So are you saying that the blood was not mingled? It was just a statement saying that their sacrifice...
They were on their way to sacrifice, and it cost them. Yeah. Yes.
And their blood, that
yes.
vein was mingled with the sacrifice.
Correct. It may have taken, depending on which one, because there are a couple of them, it may have taken place in the temple courtyards. There's a moment where Pilate has some of his Roman soldiers dressed up as commoners just scattered throughout the temple courtyard. And they actually massacred Jewish people there to worship in the temple courtyard. And if Jesus is talking about that particular one, or if that's where the question's coming from, then they're in the place of sacrifice. And I think that's very likely of the setting. But it's not that Pilate then had the soldiers take the blood, break into the Holy of Holies, and start throwing it on altars or something like that. That wasn't it. But it was in the act of going to worship that they were sacrificed, essentially. That's actually not a rabbit I expected to chase today. But yeah, so that's where reading the Old Testament provides some challenges. I wanted to check time and see where we're at. There's some other ones as well. So when you go into the land of Canaan, you are supposed to kill all the Canaanites. Non-Canaanites get a pass. You can try to hammer out a surrender on their end where they become your servants, but you don't have to kill them all. Canaanites, you've got to slaughter all of them. And so they finally go into the land, and the first city they come to is... They do some wall marching. And the first thing that happens is you don't kill all of the Canaanites. Because Rahab. The other thing that I'd point out there, Rahab and Ruth, both in the lineage of Christ, right? Are Jews supposed to marry outside the tribe? Priests aren't. There's some wiggle room for commoners. Unless you ask Ezra. Anybody know what Ezra has to say about foreign wives? Forced divorce is the order of the day for the people as they return from captivity. We should get rid of all of the non-Jewish wives and who else? Any children from that offspring. Not only do they not count as part of the community, but we're kicking them out and sending them away. Man, that sounds gracious. Especially when, as they head into captivity, at least 2 of the prophets suggest that captivity is a great time to settle down. Work to the benefit and growth of the people who have taken you on as captives, because what good does it do you to fight you? Your rescue is only going to come in God's time. Suddenly, when they return to the land, Ezra says, nope. Get rid of all of them. What do we do with that? How do we have Ezra and then also Rahab and Ruth?
Well, maybe Ezra as well.
And see, the thing that I will point out is that very rarely should we read these stories as morality tales. Not every passage in the Bible is a go and do likewise passage. Now, we tend to approach it that way. And part of that is because of the way we've kind of been taught to read the Bible. So you sit down and you read it and you look at the story and this is what happens and it's being done by God's people, therefore it's okay. Some of those stories, it lines up. This is what God has told them to do. And some of them, like Ezra, it's kind of strange trying to figure out what's going on. And Ezra is one of those books that provides a more historic accounting. He's trying to keep things relatively accurate. It's not a whole lot of narrative. It's a whole lot of recording. So you raise a valid question. Was Ezra right to have the people forced to divorce their wives and kick their children away? Because Ruth and Rahab, in the lineage of Christ, they obviously belong to the people. They become a part of the tribe. But Ezra won't allow for that to happen in his generation. And in the Ezra story, Ezra 10, if you want to read it in totality, there are some priests who stand up to Ezra. And they're not killed. They're not kicked out of the camp. It's included as a detail. The story never ends with saying who's right and who's wrong. What we have is a command from Ezra, a general following of the people, some who stood up against it, and then Ezra ends. But it's hard to make a morality tale out of that, so we don't read it. We like the early part of Ezra where they build the foundation of the temple and then they worship and there's this great noise because of the weeping of the older people who remember the glory of the temple and the joy of the younger people who've never seen a temple dedicated to God in their lives, and so even the foundation is amazing. I can teach that. But forced divorce is not really on my teaching from the pulpit wavelength. It's hard. And when we try to flatten the Bible, we miss some of those challenges that were lived and experienced by the people of God. And I think maybe the good part about having stories like that in the Bible, Old Testament or New Testament, is that we understand that being a community has always been challenging, and people have, for the most part, been responsible to do the best they can, and sometimes they do good and sometimes they don't. And there are consequences to failing to be the community of God. But even just living that out is a struggle. I also want to point this out with 4 minutes left of class. Y'all been way quieter talking about the Old Testament than when we've talked about the New. Why is that?
You read the New more than the Old.
Yep, right.
I rarely assign homework, and when I do, it's usually only jokingly. I'm going to assign homework this week. Go read a book out of the Old Testament. Don't read a story. Isolating those things into stories is, I think, part of our problem. Pick a book. Doesn't have to be a huge one. Ruth's pretty easy, relatively important. And as you read it, the things I want you to look for are keywords that get repeated. Because very often, the point that the author is trying to make in the sharing of that story is found in the keywords. The other thing I'll point out is look for what's not written. And here's what I mean by that in Ruth. According to the law, you're supposed to leave the edges of your field ungleaned, right? So why does Ruth need protection in order to glean the edges of the field? In the faithful city of Bethlehem, described as a faithful city.
Keep her safe.
Shouldn't be necessary, should it?
They shouldn't.
Maybe it wasn't the gleaning of the field, but the people that were at the edge of the field.
They're Bethlehemites.
Yes. So,
This is the faithful city. They're faithful compared to the other cities in the land.
this is the same city that crucified Christ, so we're not going to...
Well, I mean, they all did. Let's not isolate Bethlehem in that one. Which tells us something about the land at the time, doesn't it? If the faithful city of Bethlehem, described that way in the book of Ruth, something we often overlook, is struggling that mightily to keep one of the basic tenets of the law. What does that say about Ruth and Boaz's faithfulness in the process? That's not how we usually read that story, is it?
Oh, yes, we do.
Not really. We like what it has to say about some form of redemption. We don't understand the meaning of feet.
Well, it all depends on which one rabbit hole you go down.
It's that one. We miss the legal implications of them needing to protect somebody gleaning at the edges of the field. We don't understand what that says about community. We miss that in the faithful city, the person who's supposed to redeem her first chooses not to. Which, again, all along the way is reminding us that maybe things are not as they should be. Maybe things are never as they should be. And there's always this question about who's going to be and who's not.
But all of this fits together to accomplish the task.
Very much so. We tend to pick the details that come either most easily or most comfortably. And we miss stuff along the way.
If we're reading the Old Testament as the story of God, I'd rather say not Old Testament,
Yes.
but the First Testament, okay? If we're reading that story of God dealing with his people and his creation, that story has a goal.
Yes.
It's pointing somewhere.
Yes.
And that's the way I think you need to read the overall story. Who is this God, and why is he doing what he's doing, and who are these people?
Yep. So this is the final point. You set it up very nicely. the way you read the Old Testament is as a theology book. It's a book of God. It's a book about God. It tells us about who God is. God is the primary character in all of the stories. And so if we're reading it for the details of people's lives, we very often miss the God in the midst, or what God is doing along the way. So we need to read for a different purpose or with different eyes. So you look at these stories not as what moral point should I take from this? And the Old Testament almost never teaches us anything about doctrine. Instead, we were looking for who is God? And what does it mean to be a child, a person, a member of the tribe of God? And then the other thing we've got to look at for these stories is why they mattered to the people who kept them. Because these are not the only stories of Israel, are they? The history of an ancient people constituted over thousands of years requires more than this number of books. So why these stories? If you sit with me as we talk through Old Testament classes more directly, and for those of y'all who started in here with me when we started on Genesis, you heard some of those comments. Well, this is when that was written down, and here's what's going on in the lives of people, so here's why this story means so much to them. That's an important consideration for us as well. That requires some more digging. And again, we like our flat reading of the Bible because it doesn't require much of us. But we miss so much when we do that. Yeah, Larry, then close.
It's interesting that God let the good, the bad, and the ugly to come out in the Old Testament. If this wasn't a true, accurate representation of what's there, or what happened, or whatever, in the author's view, it would have all been sanitized. But he said, the Jephthahs came out, all these things came out in there, the Sodom and Gomorrah, and all that stuff came out.
What's true and accurate is what it has to say about God.
Right. It lends credibility to the truth. I mean, it's an accurate representation of what the person wrote back then. And the point is there, it's like Bob was saying, you're getting to Jesus, that's what you want to get to the salvation.
The problem is very often we want to skip there, and we miss so much of what actually builds there. And I think when we better understand the Old Testament, we better understand Jesus. I don't think you can understand the New Testament fully without having a very good grasp of the Old Testament. And that's been a failure on the part of churches for a long time. Even how we build ourselves. We are a New Testament church. So often I see that on billboards. I'm like, oh, gross. Because you're missing so much of the story. And you're isolating the parts that you can digest most easily. Or you can co-opt. Take it and then make it mean whatever you want it to mean. When you take the First and Second Testaments together, the Hebrew Bible is another way you'll see it in writing, and then the New Testament, you start seeing this bigger picture of what it means to be the community of God, to be loved by God, and to love God, and what it looks like to struggle along the way to achieve that. I think all of that is very important consideration. All right. Done. 4 minutes over. We will be talking about the Old Testament for the next several weeks because we get to talk about poetry, which I love and y'all don't. We already clarified that a few weeks ago.
History and poetry.
We get to talk. Yeah. Just show back up in like 6 weeks.
Yeah, exactly.
How are you?
Okay, fine.
I saw a note. You've been a week or two now minus migraine?
Until last night.
Oh no.
So did